Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the fourth episode of the fourth season of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion in America. The last episode was an engaging and far reaching conversation on religion and hip hop. And if I do say so myself, it was a wonderful and really moving conversation. I wanted to thank Drs. Andre Johnson, Dr. Darius Hills, and Dr. Erica Galtz for a fantastic engagement and thoughtful conversation about hip hop, Black culture, and the wider impact on American culture and religion. If you didn't get a chance to catch it, please check it out on our YouTube channel. I also wanted folks to know that the panelists have been at work on a religion and hip hop at 50 years syllabus that you will be hearing more about soon. And today, in addition to that, I want to take this moment to invite you all to check out many of the teaching and engagement resources and show notes that go alongside each of the episodes that we produce. They include syllabi, articles, videos that the panelists have shared. The goals of these episodes is to start a conversation and then to carry them out in your classroom and our communities and conferences throughout the country and hopefully around the world. So we hope that you will check out our YouTube channel, that you'll go to our Facebook site, or that you'll go to our website and find out and engage in many of these really thoughtful notes and resources that go along with each of these episodes. I wanted to remind folks that throughout today's session, we are asking for all of the participants to submit your questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. This will enable our hosts and the panelists to engage these questions as they facilitate this very important conversation. This afternoon, I would like to introduce you to our moderator for what I am sure is going to be a rich discussion examining new theorizations of the secular and secularism, a conversation that is going to move us, I believe, across multiple historical moments and throughout and across different disciplines. And I know that this panel is going to push and stretch us as we think about why the current evangelical revival, discourses on Afro-pessimism, and rising political partisanship cannot be read apart from the histories of and discourses on the secular. And we have brought together a powerhouse group of people to have this conversation with and for you all today. And so I want to take this moment to introduce our host for this afternoon, Dr. Brian Steensland, who is the professor and chair of sociology at IUPUI and the Director of Social Science Research at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Dr. Steensland's areas of interest include religion, culture, politics, and civic life in contemporary American society. His most recent book includes Situating Spirituality, Context, Practice, and Power. And he's also written on the new evangelical social engagement. He is currently doing a study on religion and parenting that is being supported by the Lilly Endowment. And I'm so excited to introduce Brian and for him to host this really important conversation on the continued interest in the secular and secularism and how we can study and think about it across a number of disciplines. So I'll now hand over the panel to Brian Steensland and can't wait for us to enjoy this really rich conversation.
Thank you, Joseph. Good afternoon, everyone. Joseph has given us quite a mandate, and I think we're up to the task, so thank you for that. The study of secularism and the secular has always been of interest to scholars of religion. This is not necessarily a new interest, but the time does seem ripe for a return to this category, to imagine new theories and new theorists, to explore its continuing usefulness and applications. As some of you viewers might know, just 2 days ago, the Pew Research Center released a large research report on the so-called religious nones or the non-affiliated. And it showed, for instance, just how blurry the boundaries between the religious and the secular really are. So for all the reasons that Joseph pointed to, the time is now, for this conversation. We have three really terrific panelists. I'd like to introduce them pretty briefly. They warrant a lot more words than I'm going to be able to provide, but I do want to get straight to the conversation. Lucia Holsether is an assistant professor of religious studies at Skidmore College. She is the chair of the Secularity and Secularism unit in the American Academy of Religion. She looks at the intersection of secularism and the rise of racial capital, and she is interested in the ways that secularism interacts with things like religious pluralism. Lee Schmidt is the Edward C. Mallinckrodt Distinguished University Professor of the Humanities at Washington University in St. Louis. Lee is the author of a number of acclaimed and award-winning books on American religion and culture. Two that are particularly relevant, I think, to today's conversation are Village Atheist, How America's Unbelievers Made Their Way in a Godly Nation, and Restless Souls, The Making of American Spirituality, both fantastic books. And then Joseph Winters is the Alexander F. Haymeyer Associate Professor of Religious Studies and African American Studies at Duke University. He looks at the ways in which discourses on secularity and secularism open up avenues of alternative modes of belonging for African Americans. He is particularly interested in the ways that secularism is related to the organization of agnostic, non-religious Black communities. And his latest work looks at Afro-pessimism and its relationship to secularism. So welcome to everyone. Welcome to our viewers. I hope that in the process of this conversation, the panelists will share more details about their work and the links between the kind of broad topic of secularism and the particular agenda setting work that you're doing. So I'm looking forward to learning more and hearing more details myself. I want to start with a pretty broad question, and it's really the kind of what are we talking about question. What are we talking about when we talk about secularism? And I say this as somewhat of an outsider. I'm a sociologist of religion, so my main research agenda is on religion. But I'm in a field where the study of religion is just often this one corner. And a lot of my colleagues study health and medicine, they study race, they study demography, they study family, they study so many things that could be understood as in the sphere of the secular and could be understood through a frame of the secular or secularism, but it's not a concept that shows up in a lot of that non-religious work, right? So this is kind of a nerdy way of saying that secularism or the secular is a really encompassing category. It's relevant to almost everything, arguably. And so a kind of introductory question that I'm going to pitch to Lucia first is, what are helpful ways of thinking about the concept of the secular or secularism? And I guess in particular, when is it relevant? When is it a relevant concept to invoke? Because it's almost always relevant in some sense, right? So when is it relevant for you? When is it relevant for scholars today? What are you seeing in your own work and in the field?
Thanks so much, Brian, for that great introduction and great, very big question, which I know that the other panelists will also have answers to. So I'm going to give really top level kind of framing, I think, around this question about what are helpful ways of thinking about the secular and sort of how do I see it used? What's my own framework? I kind of think as a starting point, we need to think about the secular, or it's helpful to me to think about the secular as one side of a pair of terms and discourses, or one side of a pair of terms, the other term being religion or religious, that together make up a discourse that often gets sort of constituted through this idea of an opposition between the religious and the secular. So that's another way of kind of saying that any evocation of the secular or an attempt to define the secular is probably going to be tied to a complementary idea of what religion, the complementary term, means, and also where religion is, who is religious, what kinds of polities are shaped or not by religion. I think in order for an idea of the secular to be recognizable or to even register it as something worth talking about, there's going to be a set of assumptions about religion. And often those are particular religious movements like Christianity or Islam, or sort of you can think about a sort of a secularized religious history sometimes when we think about the secular. The other thing I would want to say at just like top level, and I'm sure we'll get into more concrete examples, is that ideas about the relationship between what is religious and what is secular are always going to be intersecting with ideas about what is private and what is public. Who is a rational actor, who is driven by reason, and who is a non-rational actor driven by some sort of abstract belief, perhaps. Also, who is a free agent, who is in control of their own decisions. And who is under some kind of influence, who is possessed, who is not a full agent. And often those kinds of distinctions map onto some concept of the religious and the secular. I am particularly interested in my work in questions about public-private and the secular, particularly because of how they map onto issues around property, labor, and gender and sexuality. And I just want to say here that when I think about these terms, I think the scholars I am most drawn to are feminist scholars like Janet Jacobson and Anne Pellegrini, who have built on the important work of Talal Asad in thinking about, in particular, formations of Protestant Christian secularism, ideas about our ideas about what counts as secular, what counts as religion, what counts as religious are often shaped by the histories of Protestant Christianity that are forming our lens in the first place. So I'll stop there. I'm sure there's more to say, but that's kind of where I would go first.
Fantastic, thank you, Joe.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I want to thank Joe for the invitation. Thank you, Brian, for the introduction, and I'm glad to be on this panel with Lee and Lucia. I really, Lucia kind of stole what I was no, I'm just kidding. She kind of really took what more eloquently and brilliantly, but I mean, one way to think about it, and I'm just kind of riffing off of what she just said, is that religion and the religious and the secular are conjoined twins, right? Like you have to think them together, they're co-constitutive. And one way to think about it is if I'm teaching a course introducing students to the modern theories of religion, right? And getting to think about religion itself as a kind of, modern invention. The idea that religion is, first of all, like, let's say, a universal kind of human quality, or the idea that different kinds of traditions like Buddhism, Judaism, Candomblé express something the same called religion, right? That is actually, that is not only a modern construct, right? But as Lucia points out, it has something to do with not only Protestant Christianity, but a certain kind of expansion, right? A certain kind of expansion of Protestant Christianity across the globe through capital coloniality and so forth, right? And again, just to go back to what Lucia said, I mean, like any definition that I would give of secularity or secularization would involve religion in some way, right? Whether it's the theory, very problematic theory about the disappearance of religion, right? Or the privatization of religion, it would have to be some kind of dialectical definition, right? Where religion, whereas, as Lucia points out, a certain understanding of religion or assumption about religion is part of that definition. And then I would just say, just to kind of add on, like, I'm really interested in how certain kinds of, we might say, certain concepts, certain rituals, certain phenomena really blur that distinction between, right, the secular and the religious, right? So for something like a concept like sovereignty, right? Certain political theologians are thinking about this all the time, but sovereignty, redemption, right? We might even think of sacrifice, right? Myths, right? I mean, secular polities have their myths of origins and so forth, right? And I think there's certain authors, like Emile Durkheim, I know Lucia's going to get at me about this, but someone like Emile Durkheim, whose notion of the sacred actually helps us think about how secular polities constitute the sacred, or I'm sorry, produce the sacred through a certain kind of rituals and social practices, right? So in my work, I'm interested in how, particularly a certain category of the sacred, and what Durkheim might call the double notion of that sacred, and we can get into that, actually shows how what people consider to be a certain understanding of secular as the non-religious, actually some of those distinctions kind of break down in the face of something like the sacred. So I'll stop with that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Lee? You are...
All right, I got it. So thanks for hosting this, Brian, and for the introduction. Great to be with you, Lucia and Joe. Yeah, so I'll start at the broad level here too. I agree with what Joe and Lucia have been saying so far. I guess I would say there, as I kind of try to organize these approaches and how people talk about this. I mean, there is this at one level, and I would say this is the prevailing form of analysis, is to think about the secular and secularism in these political terms. That it's a way of thinking about modern forms of statecraft or the extension of empire, how religion is managed, disciplined, regulated. It's the secularism masquerades as in neutral terms, but is constantly regulating religious minorities, and is incredibly useful for these modern forms of statecraft. So that's a kind of managerial, disciplinary, kind of a political grammar that you're looking for in these discourses about the secular. And that's the Talal-Assad, Joan Scott, the kinds of things that Joe and Lucia have already, that literature that they've alluded to. A second one is the secularization literature. I mean, there for a while, it looked like we were going to give up the secularization stuff because religion proved so astonishingly resilient. So we grew tired of that. And now, of course, there's a way in which that's coming back around, through all of this attention to this great dechurching of the United States and this, the seeming ascendancy of the nuns. So there are these questions that are more, again, like an old secularization narrative. Is the United States finally becoming secular in ways that are similar to Great Britain or Sweden or something like that? So it's come back around. Yeah, and then, it's that question about, well, what do we even mean by that secularization process? Is it the privatization of religion? Is it the disappearance of religion? Is it the fragmentation, pluralization of religion? So, I mean, those kinds of questions, classic sociological questions, but also I would say the kind of Charles Taylor kind of questions. And then there's this third set of questions, and this tends to be where I do my work. That doesn't mean it's the best way to do the work. It may be the least engaging way to do the work, but it's the kind of more at this lived, embodied, practical, on the ground level. And there's a historian of German secularism, 19th and 20th century, Todd Weir. He makes the distinction between those who study political secularism, that is the people who do more of the discourse theory, and the people who do worldview secularism, which is what he does, and that's more the kind of on the ground world of secular people. And there's some of this also in Joseph Blankholm's work, that kind of, orienting it more to these ethnographic ways. So there's that kind of question too. And I think all three of these approaches are productive, but they have produced, distinct literatures. Sometimes they're in conversation, and sometimes I think we get confused by the fact that all of these different groups of scholars are, similarly drawn to secularism studies, right? So sometimes it's just kind of like, okay, there are these different ways of approaching this within this emergent field of secular studies. And anyway, that would be my flying high over the landscape view.
Yeah, that's really helpful. What you were saying about the term kind of reminds me of the complaint that I and probably every other graduate student in the world has, is like, why can't these academics just agree on what term X means, right? Because you sort of assume that words have fixed given meanings, and then you realize that's far from the case, right? So the agenda that Lee laid out, I think is really interesting, because there's kind of there's one that links claims about the secular to power and authority and statecraft. And then there are elements that are, maybe more diachronic, whether it's looking at secularization or whether it's looking at kind of genealogies of meaning. And then there's the lived religion kind of to secularity approach. And then there's also what Lucia was getting at, which is kind of this almost kind of, there's this kind of cultural structure of religion and secular, and things tend to get lined up on those binaries, maybe often related to power, such as public and private, or virtuous and not virtuous, or what have you, right? So I'm wondering, and you don't have to stick with that framework necessarily, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit autobiographically about how you came to be interested in secularism as a way of talking about what you're working on now. Because I think for graduate students, especially who are tuning in, like where an idea comes from and how to plug into kind of debates and frameworks is something that, you don't stop struggling with as a grad student, but I think you're especially attuned to it then, right? So can you say, and not all of you necessarily have to respond, but can you say a little bit about where your particular interest into the secular or secularism came from, and how it kind of connects with these broader field level things? And that's a wide open question.
Who wants to do the autobiographical reflection? I mean,
it doesn't have to be deep autobiography,
okay,
right?
right.
But just kind of, why
Sure.
did secularism appear to be relevant to you in some sense or another?
Right. I mean, there's, in my own sort of sense of this, there is a kind of arc here that relates to my own relationship to Protestantism over time. I mean, I grew up in a liberal, progressive Christian world. In that kind of out of that 60s, 70s into the 80s progressive Protestant world. And, and we could go through what the touchstones of that were. And I think in that world, partly there's a, because it comes out of a more evangelical background, there was a certain fascination, with the evangelicals. So on the one hand, you didn't have that version of Protestantism. So initially there's sort of an interest, like, well, what are all these people at Calvary Chapel doing over there, having these altar calls still? I know my grandparents used to do altar calls, but, so there's that kind of attraction. But really there's this kind of working out of this liberal Protestant side, and where there is this kind of ongoing movement. And, so they, people who kind of gradually lose their Protestantism and become much more eclectic, the spiritual but not religious. And then it turns out some of them just keep moving. I mean, and this is not just over the last 50 years, it's a pattern we can see playing out in 19th century lives as well. So you kind of feel that, in your own family's history and your own, that kind of sense of these are the various paths they're on. And then there's finally this question I think that you get to is like, okay, after you're in this post-religious world, is there any way of engaging religion again? Like what does that look like if you get to that point? And that became a really interesting question for me, not just the secularists who were sure they were done with religion, but the ones who were wondering whether it was ethical culture people, that they could have a religion of ethical culture, or religious humanists who imagine this, or Comtean, positivists who think they can create a whole sacramental system around humanism. I mean, so those kind of questions come back around. So I think it's deeply entwined with that particular Protestant history. I mean, of where you are in a particular epoch. They shaped the questions that engaged me and how they unfolded over, a 30-year period or so. I'd like to say that's not true, that it was somehow, not coming out of that in a way. I mean, that they were a little more disengaged from that autobiography, but it seems clear, clear enough.
I can try to answer this. I don't know why I keep winding up thinking about the secular all the time. Often I wonder if it's that useful of a term, or if it obscures more than it illuminates analytically. But because it is such a live discourse, I find that I need to engage it. I think it's less autobiographical and more a methodological set of questions and evolution of my own interests from really like high school, college organizing through the book that I just finished. So on one hand, I'm going to answer a question of how did I end up writing this book that just came out called Capitalist Humanitarianism, which is a critique of the ways that socially responsible capitalism, so-called, has emerged over time as a kind of space for the exercise of solidarity politics mediated by free market structures rather than other forms of labor withdrawal, solidarity, disruption, boycott, etc. One of the questions I get a lot is, why is this a religious studies project? I have a million answers to this question. One of them is about the history of those kinds of fair trade, microfinance, et cetera, movements through Christian mission organizations. But the other thing that I often say is that that's not the most interesting thing about these actors. What's interesting about these actors and what's interesting about capitalist humanitarianism is the way that it kind of remakes the conditions of possibility for politics, for organizing, for imagining sort of futures in the world together, and how it rewrites the terms of critique. And those are the sorts of that imagining work and building work. And here I'm building on my great teacher, Catherine Lofton, is what we're doing when we study religion. One of the is thinking about how those movements progress. Now, I found in trying to work on these projects, which are interests that just, I thought, oh, wow, religious studies has really interesting tools for thinking about global capitalism. And it's not necessarily because there's a Christian history that I can expose by saying, oh, what looks secular is really Protestant. No, I'm not really interested in doing that kind of reveal move. But I often found myself sort of pushed back into saying that in order to justify my place in a religious studies department, to kind of show these Christian genealogies through what, quote, only appears to be secular, as if the sort of best route to making a critique of the capitalist hellscape that we live in now is to show how it's really religious, so not as good as we might think it is, because it's not as modern, it's not as free, it's not as woke, it's not as whatever. And so that's why I think for me, the secular has been a problem. It feels like this kind of thing where I would launder through my religious studies project by deconstructing a notion of the secular, rather than sort of asking a question that's interesting with this sort of set of tools that is available to me. The question of the secular kind of landed in my lap. That's kind of how the question of secular landed in my lap, whereas the interests that brought me to the work that I do, which require me to engage the secular, were really about what does it mean to be a union organizer? What does it mean to grieve? What does it mean to be a consumer and laborer in the frame of the wage and of monetized value that I live in right now? And those kinds of questions of meaning and politics are great questions, I think, for religion scholars, but sometimes it's hard to ask them without this triangulating move. And so the secular has been instrumentally useful for me analytically, even as it's been annoying to me because it feels like a stopover sometimes rather than going directly to the questions that feel most at stake. And this is where I think, Joe's work on the sacred is really generative. I won't come at you right now about Durkheim, Joe. unless you want to have that conversation. Yeah, I don't know if that sort of takes your question a little off field, but that's what came to mind first.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm. And it sets Joe up to talk about his work on the secular too, or sacred too.
No, I appreciate it. And thanks for not coming after me, Lucia. No, but seriously, so I mean, if I think, been thinking here and just kind of ruminating on like maybe just a couple of things, kind of biographically that kind of led, into my interest in this in the secular. I think one would be, and I started really just kind of thinking about it, right? Prompted by your question, Brian, is one is like maybe a certain kind of tension, right? Or around how often how black churches are talked about, particularly in the context of the civil rights movement, right? And how generally Islam gets talked about, right? And particularly for me, particularly right after 9/11, right? So I'm thinking about like this, this kind of very problematic discourse and pernicious discourse about, that Assad in Genealogies of Religion begins with this, right? This kind of idea that a problem with Islam is that there's no separation between the religious and the political or something like that. So it's like it's improperly, right? It's improperly secular, something like that, right? And of course, Assad is going to say, well, you're already assuming so much about what religion is, right? Some universalist notion of religion and so forth and so forth. But you also get, I mean, the flip side of that is at times you get in these same discourses a sense that, right, the Black church, particularly, or a certain wing of the Black church, right, and this is celebrated, right, actually brings together the secular and the religious, or the sacred and the profane in certain ways, or those lines get broken down, particularly in the case of somebody like King. So I guess in that case, it's right. It might be improperly secular, but insofar as it's associated with civil rights or a certain kind of triumphant notion of the civil rights movement, right, it's more acceptable, right? So I think around early 2000s, I was thinking about wrestling with that kind of tension, and I think just another thing would be, I think like Lucia and others, I mean, like I've found myself in grad school and beyond, wrestling with figures who are not always part of like religious studies canons, right? So like Frankfurt School folk, Benjamin kind of, right? But like Theodore Adorno, right? Toni Morrison, like without a doubt, people who read right Toni Morrison's work, right, would say, yeah, there's religious themes all over, right? But it's not in let's say like literary circles or courses on Toni Morrison, it's not always emphasized, right? It's not always central and so forth. And so I guess I found, particularly in taking courses when I was in grad school, and particularly taking courses outside of religious studies, is problematic or as much as I wanted to see the secular as more of a problem than any kind of stable meaning, right? I realized that it was being used, right, in those conversations as if it had a stable meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Usually it meant something like either the opposite of religion or something like, or just like the de-emphasis of religion in a particular, right, in a particular author's work or in a particular discourse, if that makes any sense. So
Mm-hmm. 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 So both you're all, especially Lucia and Joe, you're kind of hinting at, that it's kind of a constraining binary, but also an illuminating binary, that can feel like it's hemming you in, but also kind of shedding new light. So what are some things that you're reading or seeing in the field that get you excited or hold promise? And this is a question obviously for Lee too, but if we kind of have a reading on the field when it comes to studies of the secular or secularism or secularity, what pops for you and what gets you excited?
well,
Joe, do you want to go first?
yeah, I can start. I mean, I think as you mentioned, Joseph Blankholm's work, right? Lee, right? The Secular Paradox, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think what, I've just started reading that brilliant text, but it seems like one of the things that he's thinking about is that, right, he's doing all these kind of interviews of activists, atheists, those who consider themselves non-religious, and he's like, but the way that they're talking about their practices, right, and their beliefs, it sounds something like it reminds him of the religious, right? It reminds him of religion, right? And I take it that at that moment, it's interesting. And again, I have to read more of the book. Like at that moment, like it would be interesting to think, well, what is religion a placeholder for in that moment, right? It's like notions of tradition, notions of ritual, notions of belief, right? But at least it seems to me, and what I'm engaging so far is that, right, there's something about those interviews that Blankholm is doing that shows like that the line is being blurred, right? So I think that I'm also seeing at the intersection of, let's say, religious studies and Black studies, right? And I'm thinking here, many different authors, Biko Gray, J. Cameron Carter. Also thinking of a recent essay by Amoria Armstrong, right, where Armstrong is thinking with Black studies, including people like Saidiya Hartman, Christina Sharp, who are not often thought of as religious thinkers, right? But Armstrong is thinking with those two authors to kind of give a critique of Christian notions of salvation and redemption, which he calls like the kind of romance of redemption. And what's interesting, I think, what's interesting is a certain kind of theoretical approach, is like it's not in some way that Armstrong is trying to reject theology, right? But it seems a kind of re-understanding of theology by using which you might call the kind of heretical resources, right? Resources that are not usually associated with theology, religion, and so forth. If that makes any sense. So that's just one example, it seems to me, of Amory Armstrong's work. It's one example for me. Some really interesting things and Joseph Blankham, some really interesting things happening where, as you pointed out, Brian, it's like there's a blurred line, but yet it could be that there's still something generative in maintaining some of these categories and distinctions.
Yeah, I do think at that level, if you're looking at these groups of people who identify as free thinkers or agnostics or atheists or what have you, or secularists occasionally, that they are worrying a lot about that line. And it is really interesting to see, I mean, whether they are, if you ask them, I mean, this has been true, since the 19th century. I mean, they're just really concerned. On the one hand, they want to have nothing to do with religion, right? I mean, this is kind of like the way they kind of create an identity by not being religious. Like, just it's all a source of contamination. And then on the other side, there are these people, and I would say this is a minority at most points in this history, of people that are going like, well, no, religion's still a good word. And, just because we're secular, free-thinking people or unbelievers in Christianity doesn't mean we can't come up with our own religion or find ways that we can make something. And that interests me a lot. That move, like what that looks like when people start negotiating with religion rather, from a secularist standpoint, of where they want to negotiate with it rather than just set up an opposition. I think that's a really, I mean, again, it's one corner of this world, but it's an important world. I mean, I think that's where, when I look at these studies on the nuns, I mean, you've got the category is a little mixed up because all the nothings in particulars are really kind of indifferent. It gets much more interesting when you have like the agnostics and the atheists, which are about a third of that group, but those people have pretty clear senses of things, right? I mean, they probably may well have some sort of humanistic affiliation.
There's almost a denominational sense of belonging in a way that for the nothing particulars, there's not.
Right. So that, it's worth disaggregating the nothing in particulars from the ones there, because that's where it gets much more interesting, their negotiation of their relationship with religion and against religion.
I've been thinking, so this isn't like hot off the press work. In fact, it's pretty classic work, though I agree with everything Joe said about Amoria Armstrong's work. I have, in preparation for this conversation and just over the last few weeks in general, I've been returning to some of Edward Said's work on secular criticism. I think Said is using the concept of the secular in ways that kind of cut through some of these like over binarized, sort of like over reified notions of the secular and the religious as really stable categories. And for Said, in The World, the Text, the Critic, The secular is more of like almost like an ethical position or an orientation towards criticism of reified forms from a specific position. So I think sometimes the way that the idea of the secular gets produced, and this is, I think, simpatico with what Lee just said about the importance of looking at people who are self-defining as secular or nothing in particular or whatever, like those are like deeply embodied forms of being rather than like out there, oh, we have a secular view, is secular as something universal. Secular as that which makes possible diversity and democracy and difference to come together in a neutral plane. And Said operationalizes secular as explicitly not neutral, not transcendent, deeply material, but also but also in all of those situated ways, situated is the word he uses, not attached to universalizing any of the specific meanings as applicable to everyone. And so one of the terms that gets used alongside secular in Said is exile. And of course, he is a great Palestinian writer and thinker and academic who lived in exile, and so has a relationship to a deeply rooted place and set of criticisms, but has no presumption that they would ever necessarily be made into something normative or made into a kind of generally sort of accepted reality. And so that push-pull between the concrete, the where am I looking from, and also the willingness to critically interrogate those positions without abstracting out of them, to use a very Marxian term. I think that's been an interesting, I hesitated on this question because I'm still really thinking through it. And so take this as like a question and a recommendation, like somebody who's like thinking about the secular really differently from a lot of what I often see and read in religious studies and also like in the New York Times or whatever, is Edward Said in thinking about the politics of scholarship and interpretation. So that's what I would put forward right now.
I think you're going to send a bunch of us back over to our bookshelves right after this is over to look at that again. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind people that the chat function is live. So if you have questions that you'd like to pose to the panel, I can try and moderate that. But if you have questions or curiosities, put those in the chat. I have a question mainly probably for Joe, but certainly for everyone, because I know it relates to some of the work that you're doing or have done recently. I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on the implications of, the secularization thesis, if trends and data kind of bear it out. The implications of that for like social organization and group solidarity and identity. If you can kind of think 50 or 100 years hence, kind of if America kind of stays on its trajectory, I think you have interest in like the non-religious organizational basis of, Black communities and others, right? And so what are some things that you see or things that you think about?
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things I guess that I've been thinking a lot about, if I can think about, the relationship between present and future, as you suggested here, would be, maybe within, particularly within kind of Black studies and maybe in kind of Black literature, would be, I guess, something like speculative fiction, or even like even certain kinds of strands of apocalyptic thought, right? And I say this in a very kind of general sense, right? So thinking here about the work of Octavia Butler, right? I'm thinking here about the work of Frank Wilderson, who often uses the language of end of the world. He wouldn't use apocalyptics, but uses the language of end of the world as our only possible redemption, right? And so there's a couple of things. So I'm thinking about how even in these kind of literary kind of aesthetic theoretical conversations that I think most people would see to be, right, the very opposite. Well, not Octavia Butler, but let's say Frank Wilderson, Afro-pessimism, would consider to be something like the very opposite of religion, theological. I'm still seeing at least the language of, right, end of the world as the only kind of redemption, right? There's even moments where Wilderson's talking about in an interview about, you know, consulting, like consulting the ancestors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So part of what I'm interested in, whether it's in discourse of Afro-pessimism or other strands of Black thought, is how Black studies has offered us different conceptions of time and temporality, right? Because you mentioned 50 years, right? 50 years. So I'm thinking about the ways in which, right, like, instead of thinking linearly, for instance, more circular notions, right? Or swing, or, Ralph Ellison has a notion of time as like a boomerang. So that kind of right, brings together both the linear and the circular, right, in a certain kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if, and certainly someone like Octavia Butler's work, right, it seems to me is constantly getting us to think about how the modalities of time, past, present, and future, right, we can think about it in terms of repetition. We can think about this in terms of recurrence, and intensification. So when I think about, like, when I'm thinking about 50 years, right, if I'm still here, right, I'm thinking about 50 years, and I'm thinking in part about how even just that thought about 50 years from now, right? Even just thinking about or imagining 50 years, right, assumes a certain understanding of time and temporality, right? Which I think a lot, not just Black studies, but I would say, a lot of strands of critical theory have gotten us to think, right, at least question and interrogate, right, how we might think about time, temporality, how time unfolds. I hope that makes sense. It might, right? But for me, when I'm thinking about how at least certain strands of Black studies, Black aesthetics, right, are getting us to think about 50 years from now, I'm also thinking about, right, how those discourses are getting us to think, interrogate what are the assumptions about time and temporality, right? How might we think differently from, let's say, certain kinds of linear or progressive, right, notions of time.
Great. Would anyone else like to weigh in on the organization, identity, belonging question? If not, while you're thinking about that, let me read or summarize two questions from our audience. One is kind of a future agenda question. What do you think are the most underexplored aspects of the secular? Where does scholarship need to go to significantly enhance our understanding of secularism or the secular? The other is a broader and multifaceted question about the sacred and the plurality of the sacred, and where kind of sacredness or challenges to sacredness, come from in a more secularized setting. So feel free to tackle either or both of those as you wish.
Well, on the first question, thinking about it historically, I find that there's been a lot more work done on the later 19th century at this point. There's this kind of sense of this is well, for one thing, secularism as a category is coined and gains some currency, from the 1850s on. So there's been a fair amount of attention there. I would say there's been a lot less attention. I mean, partly because there's a kind of myth about how these kind of secular free thinking movements go away. And I think there's just a less attention in that period from, I don't know, 1910 to 1960. I mean, we don't know nearly as much. And the political economic cross currents are really interesting. Eventually, I mean, after World War II, some of the legal history is pretty well defined, but there's a lot going on in that in between period that we just haven't followed that stuff out at all. We don't know very much about it. So historically, I would think that. And I just, there's still a lot more, if you just think about the diversity of these secular movements too. I mean, I think, we still know relatively little about humanistic Judaism and some of that. We know, we're starting to know more about Black free thinkers, but there's still a lot to be done on Black humanism, and I know there's Christopher Cameron and Anthony Penn. I mean, there's initiatives in that way, and the issues on sexuality, are pressing too. I think there's again good literature, but there are a lot of these areas where even though there's been promising work, a lot more can be done. There's this new book, Todd Weir again, German historian, read Secularism, on the relationship between secularism and socialism. And I do think those more radical currents are underappreciated. I mean, that kind of really the connections with anarchism and, really radical critique of religion. And again, in that period, 20s, 30s, 40s, I just think that there's you're getting a historian's answer there, but there are definitely things we don't know nearly enough about yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if these are going to be particularly informed answers. I think about like the kinds of works that I would be really interested in reading, and one comes to mind, and I think the person who asked this question, Margot Creeder Robinson, sounds like you're writing an amazing dissertation on religion, secularism, and ecological issues and reproduction. I think somebody making sense of the ways that claims about value, ecological value, the value of the future, the value of the human life versus other kinds of life, capital value, and how those claims to value are made through recourse to the sacred, the secular, and are they being differentiated at all, would be really interesting. One of the most striking moments in my field work on these kind of billionaires who are trying to save the world environmentally was when there's this guy who's like a billionaire investor who took a sabbatical from his hedge fund investing to go and read all of the great religious texts as defined by him in the world, and came back and was like, capital is going to become a new church. All these theologians have said that capitalism is an idolatrous church, and that means we need a different and better church of capital that's going to synthesize all these views of all the great religions of the world. Okay, anybody who's taken that, who's read like Tomoko Masazawa can give a rundown on why that's a problem. But this idea of a kind of universalism that's also a salvific universalism, that's a little bit, that's like mobilizing the sacred towards a, I don't know, secular-ish universal for environmental justice that's also lined up with capital. Like, those are the things that I feel like I don't totally have the tools to use yet, both as they're being articulated as controlling discourses, but also as individual people are navigating them in their lives. So I think some like eco-justice kinds of claims vis-a-vis capitalism and value would be interesting. The other thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is this discourse of religious nationalism, and particularly Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, which are all terms, to be frank, like I'm not sure about their use. I think often in some of the concerns about like rising like religious right power, Hindu nationalist power, etc., there's this sort of undercurrent of, if only we could get back to the secular state, if only these fringe religious actors would stop taking over democracy. And so I think that I would like to read things that are more self-critical about the ways that critiques of the right from liberal and left positions may be smuggling in particular uninterrogated notions of secular, like secularism or secularist kind of positions, which are often like not super self-interrogating about their racial and gender politics, particularly because of how they're delineating public and private space. So those are kind of things where like, oh, I'm kind of puzzling this out. I'd love to read something interesting about it. But I'm just really one person in this field. So you know, I'm sure other people will have better ideas than I will about this.
There's a question around the sacred, right, and the kind of the plurality, right, of the sacred, right. So I want to take that very seriously, right. There's obviously like we can think about, I mean, sacred as space, sacred as set of practices, sacred as, right, a kind of way of producing, you know, the social. Like there's obviously many different ways in which that can be. Which I say it can be constructed, interpreted, reconstructed, deconstructed, and so forth, right? I guess I'm very much interested, at least in my my work, in a certain kind of doubleness, right? At least one kind of doubleness within the sacred, or the notion of being set apart, right? So here I'm drawing on people like Durkheim, George Bataille, Mary Douglas, and others, but a certain right, if that which is set apart, right, obviously introduces the notion of like taboo, prohibition, that which can't be touched, right? Certain kind of boundaries and markers, right? The sacred can be associated with that which with the space or the figure or something that you don't want to be touched, right? Like it can be with that, with what you want to keep pure and coherent, right? That's what some have called like the kind of right hand sacred, right? But the sacred can also be associated with those forces, right? Beings, spaces that you're worried about, like being forces of contamination, right? Right, being those actually forces that can contaminate, right? And of course, contaminate, we're thinking about it just symbolic as much as we're talking about physical and so forth. So anyway, like that's what I mean, sometimes what Jeremy Biles calls like the left-hand sacred, right? And so there's a kind of, obviously I'm interested in the interplay between the two, right? So I'm interested in how, right, certain kinds of how that very interplay, right, you know, gets articulated in aesthetics, right, gets articulated in certain kinds of practices, but also how a certain kind of division, right, has been has been imposed in ways that, right, mark certain kinds of practices as you know, as demonic, right, as condemnable, as evil, and so forth, right, if that makes any sense. So yeah, so for me, I guess I'm interested at least in a certain double, right, I think, which is kind of a structural claim about the double quality of the sacred, and then of course thinking about how that double quality of the sacred can play itself out in different ways, or be you know, practiced and interpreted in different ways depending on the context.
I mean, what I hear you saying loud and clear is that the kind of analytic value of the sacred doesn't diminish as we shift our frame to the secular or secularism, right? So we're kind of running short on time. I do have a question that hopefully you can maybe answer somewhat briefly, and it's a comparative one. I would imagine Joe and Lee, and I'm less sure with Lucia, kind of identify as Americanists, and I wonder if views outside America, comparative frameworks, are helpful as we think about secularism and secularity in this country, which has a distinctive trajectory and context, of course, relative to other times and places. Do you have any kind of immediate and unfortunately kind of quick thoughts on that? Lee, I'm going to pick on you first.
Okay. Well, you know, certainly again, you know, talking about this as a historian, I mean, this is a globalizing movement. The rise of these secularist organizations. They're hosting international meetings by the end of the 19th century, and they keep doing this. I mean, they have international projects that they're working on together, whether it's, you know, can be very mundane. They're very into, you know, erecting a statue of Bruno in Rome, for example, all of them pooling their resources from around the world, or, you know, providing for secular funerals and, you know, around the world. So there are these global networks in these circles, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and there are many of these secular evangelists who are traveling there. right? I mean, they're moving about and doing it. So I do think, I mean, it's partly comparative, but it's also just it's so interconnected. And I haven't, that would be, I'd put this on my list of things too. People, we haven't really looked at those networks very well. I mean, and like the editors who move and they start the Journal in London, they end up in Toronto, and then I mean, there's just there's a huge, well, huge. I mean, we're talking about free thinking organizations. Huge is probably the wrong adjective, but significant networks, and I think that I would love that. I mean, and it becomes it's outside Europe. I mean, there are connections. You'll see these positivist connections in Brazil, or where or you'll see, rationalist society connections in India. So there is considerable, play here. So I think you have a more global perspective, is really, and it does tend to, I mean, so far, I might be wrong about this, it's been very national, the historiography. I mean, you'll have a study in India, you'll have a study in Britain, you'll have the study in Germany, the United States, Canada, a specialized study on free, in New Zealand or something. But that sense of the web, hasn't really come into view. So, and it's there it's there to be plumbed.
Yeah, I would be I agree, Lee, and I would be particularly interested. I think yes, there's great comparative possibility here. And I would want to connect that question of networks and webs to questions about settler colonialism and empire. And I think that those are questions that are often really productively asked in comparative frame. So one of the sort of classic critiques of secularist discourse is that there are often these formations of the secular that articulate a modern secular democratic state that is moving in and displacing and or re-educating the primitive, anachronistic, religious, superstitious minority subject, the bad religious subject. And that's a really blunt instrument and lens to look through, but it's a starting point for thinking about many versions of Islamophobia that we see in the United States, in Israel, Palestine, in China right now. What are official state secularisms that are justifying settler colonialism and incarceration and genocide? I think thinking about comparative settler secularisms and comparative secular nationalisms that are connected to self-identified religious movements, whether that's any number of them, is incredibly important. Partly as a sort of set of political and intellectual questions, but also to refine some of the larger kind of theoretical frameworks we have for doing that kind of comparative work in the first place, and perhaps rethinking what we mean when we say secular nationalism in general. That's what I would say. That's a great question.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I'm interested. Even as we talk, and I think this is what's suggested in what Lee and Lucia said, is that even as one situates themselves, let's say, in the Americas, right, that one could even see the Americas as a kind of what Charles Long calls a contact zone, right, a zone of like contact or collision between, I mean, he's thinking in terms of Europe, Africa, and indigenous, right, indigenous Americans, but of course, there are, right, obviously other regions. We can think Asia, Pacific, and so forth, right? But it does seem to me that what's interesting about, I mean, Long is trying to foreground the settler colonial, right, slavery, right, the involuntary presence of black people. But it seems to me that what Long what someone like Charles Long offers us is potentially, right, if we think that contact zone differently, right, and think certain spaces, right, maybe certain spaces where the religious secular kind of conjunction happens, right, then maybe these terms can get disarticulated and reframed in a certain way. I'm just thinking, just really quickly, I mean, mean, just thinking, for instance, about like C.L.R. James talking about, right, Black Jacobin is the Haitian Revolution, right? And the way that he begins there talking about, right, before a battle, right, you have these moments of prayer, spirit possession, song, and so forth. There's the invocation of gods that happened before, battling the French or something like that, right? These enslaved, right, Africans in Haiti battling for. So again, that's just one. I can give other examples, but it just seems to me in my classes, when we take seriously these moments, let's say on a plantation or on a slave ship for certain rituals, right? Or certain kind of colonial administrative laws, right? That, let's say in like Trinidad, for instance, as Tracy Hucks and Diane Stewart have pointed out, right? Certain laws that are actually banning and prohibiting what's called obia because they see it as politically unruly and potentially, right, subversive, right? That in these examples, I just wonder if, right, there are ways in which, right, our understanding of the secular in its relation to religion gets reframed, right? Not that it rejects some of the kind of prevailing conversations, but it might give us, different kind of entry points into the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to be the bad guy and call us to a close. I would like to deeply thank Lucia, Lee, and Joe for spending this hour and some odd with us. I'd like to encourage all the participants to look up their work. It is fantastic and sheds a lot of light and depth on secularism and secularity, and I think it will reward your time. So thank you for the hour that you spent with us. Thank you for the great work that you're doing and continue to do. Just a word to remind everyone that this is part of an ongoing series. So stay tuned for our next Religion and, which is Religion and War. This is going to be available as a webinar on YouTube if you want to check back on our website to find the recording. And if you would be so kind, and I say this as a sociologist who's sympathetic towards such things, if you'd like to complete the very short survey that you will get after the webinar, that helps us figure out what you're interested in and do this more and do it better. So thank you sincerely to the panelists. Thank you to the audience that tuned in. And I think at that, I will call us to a close. Thank you all.